Good old Sega, one of the pillars of gaming's history and something that gets me way too excited. You know, something I've always found to be kind of weird about the video game industry nowadays is we have companies that aren't even video game companies making video game consoles. Now, some might say, who cares? We don't really need video game companies making video game consoles, we just need them making video games. Well, call me an old timer, but I remember back when video game companies made the two hottest consoles on the market, and it seemed to make for far better competition. And what makes for good competition? How about the two competitors being different from each other? Sega and Nintendo each had unique identities and their own special approach to video games. If you were playing some Sega, it felt like you were playing some Sega. With PlayStation and Xbox, it's like, oh, 90% the same games, but the analog sticks are in different spots. Now there's something. Sega versus Nintendo was a rivalry worth talking about, and it's not just me who feels this way. Sega versus Nintendo has had books written about it. You ever see any books written about Xbox versus PlayStation? Okay, one book about it, but I'm hardly impressed. When I think of Sega, I think of passion and inspiration. I mean, just look at what they named some of their consoles: Genesis, Saturn, Dreamcast. PlayStation has literally just named their consoles by numbering them. Imagine if somebody named their children that way. Meanwhile, Xbox just tries to keep naming their consoles the same thing. And yeah, I know what some of you might be thinking. If Sega was so creative and brilliant, then why aren't they still making consoles now, Mr. Wise Guy? Well, having good creative sensibilities and having good business sensibilities aren't always the same thing. Otherwise, I'm pretty sure I would have cashed in on this Ninja Turtles coloring I did by now. Plus, being creative always means taking a bit of a risk. You're trying something unknown and you don't know how people are going to respond to it. Sometimes it pays off big, but sometimes you get burned. A game like Nights into Dreams on the Sega Saturn, made by Sonic Team, probably deserved to be way more popular than it was back in the day. Looking back at it now, a full-fledged, hyped-up Sonic game probably would have sold better. Luckily though, through the magic of retro gaming, a lot of stuff gets a second chance and finally gets the appreciation it deserves. And at the top of that list is a lot of Sega stuff, which explains some of the super high prices you see for a lot of its games now. Thing is, more people appreciating Sega now doesn't really help them as much as it would have back when, you know, they were bleeding money and trying to stay in the hardware race, but it does help with how people remember Sega. Some bad decisions and bad ideas, sure, but also a company that tried really hard and left its mark on gaming with some great stuff that retro gamers alike are still enjoying now. What it comes down to for me is Sega's specific identity, the way they branded themselves, and how hard they tried. For a lot of people, Sega's relevancy kicked into gear with the Genesis, and as we all know, Sega really, and I mean really, wanted to beat Nintendo, going directly at them. Perhaps the most notable effort was Sega's attempt to have a mascot to rival Mario. Alex Kidd just wasn't good enough. I can only imagine the insecurity complex he must have. Now, as great and as popular as Sonic was, it's also a huge disservice to everything else Sega did to say that Sega only ever had Sonic and that's it. That's like saying my face is all that I am. But check this out, I got fingers, hands, legs, you name it. But before we talk about how Sega was more than just Sonic, let's talk about Sonic. Here's what gets me. It's one thing to say you want a mascot to rival Mario. It's entirely something else to actually do it. Just ask our old buddy Mr. Nuts. What made Sonic so successful is that not only was the character itself likable, but it translated to a game where the gameplay felt like something only Sega would have come up with for one of its own consoles. I've always felt like Sonic wouldn't have existed without the Genesis. There's something about a console's identity that influences what type of games appear on it. By being in control of a console's identity, not to mention the design of the hardware itself, it provides creative influence for not only the games Sega made themselves, but also games that other developers would create for it. Take a look at the Castlevania and Contra franchises around that time. The Super Nintendo had some solid entries, but the games made for the Genesis took on the style of the Genesis. I mean, they were named Bloodlines and Hardcore. How often do you see those words in the titles of Nintendo games? A game like Gunstar Heroes, what many consider to be a top game for the Genesis, was specifically targeted by the developer Treasure because they felt the console's processor was the best fit for their action-heavy game. Streets of Rage 2 was built around the unique sound hardware of the Genesis, and what about Mean Bean Machine? You think beans that are mean would be allowed on a Nintendo machine? Forget about it, folks. Also, if we're gonna talk about Sega's identity, then we have to mention the arcade influence. Not only was Sega big in the arcades themselves, but often had hardware that was well catered to high-quality arcade ports. I've seen the argument made before that Sega had a harder time transitioning away from arcade games into the more home console-like games the way Nintendo did with games such as Zelda, but regardless of whether or not somebody wants to make that argument, it's fair to say that Sega had a great representation of arcade games on its consoles and of course in the arcades themselves. Well, retro gamers love arcade-style games, so this is great news for us. Nothing really embodies the quick pick-up-and-play style of gameplay that so many retro gamers love quite like arcade games. And speaking of things that retro gamers love, how about 2D games? Now we're talking. Sega was arguably the company most reluctant to give up on 2D games, making its 5th generation console, the Sega Saturn, an absolute powerhouse when it came to 2D games at a time when the industry was saying, why have beautiful 2D sprite work when you can have ugly primitive 3D polygons? As a result, 2D games would often pair up pretty nicely with the Saturn. Shoot 'em ups and fighting games are always some of the best examples to bring up, and when you combine that with the Saturn controller's excellent D-pad for these types of games, yeah, it's a match made in heaven. Continuing with Sega's catering towards arcade games, we have the Dreamcast. At a time when the arcade scene was lying on its deathbed, Sega said, hey, we've got an idea, let's make a console that'll be great for arcade ports. But the Dreamcast wasn't just about arcade ports, oh no. There were exclusive home console games as well. This came at a time when they had divided up a bunch of their talent into different development teams and told them to have at it, whether it be arcade games or home console games. As a result, we got a lot of super cool and creative games. You know, how you'd probably describe some of your favorite games. This type of creative freedom and encouragement from Sega is exactly what the doctor ordered as far as I'm concerned. When the Dreamcast died, a lot of these studios would continue to make games for other consoles, and while a lot of them were great, they just felt a little out of place trying to fit in with the branding of those other consoles. Some of the more family-friendly aesthetic games fit in alright on the GameCube, but stuff like Jet Set Radio Future always felt a little out of place on a console like the Xbox. It's like keeping your toothpaste with your movies. Sure, you could do it, but it just seems a little off. I think that game would have felt more at home on the Dreamcast with the previous game in the series, which goes back to my point that having a game for your own system is always going to be a more natural fit for your audience. Why play a game like Jet Set when you can play something called Brute Force, am I right? Now, could Sega have remained on top of its game had it continued to stay in the hardware race? Well, we'll never know, but what we do know is that they are no longer in the hardware race, and they're just not what they used to be, despite a handful of good games here and there. That being said, there's a ton of awesome Sega stuff to go back to, and luckily for retro gamers, that's exactly what we do. We play the old stuff. And sure, the prices on some of it can really suck, but perhaps that's just the price we pay for not being wiser to how awesome some of their games were back in the day. Or you can always find ways to work around it. Remember, you don't always have to collect stuff in order to find a way to play it. But with that, I know a lot of you have some very passionate feelings when it comes to Sega. I sure do. I shared mine, and I'd love to hear what yours are. Perhaps you could talk about your personal experience with Sega games, or if you want to go a little deeper, you could talk about what you think Sega means to video games. Whatever your thoughts may be, leave your comment down below, and I will see ya in the next video.
He's the retro bird, yeah, and he's talking about video games. He's